My name is Aaron White, and I am from the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism in the United States, and I'm delighted to be here. I want to just very quickly thank all of our colleagues at the UN, the World Health Organization, and all of you, particularly those of you who are standing in the back, and you're still here. Thank you for staying. What I'm going to do, just briefly about me, I'm a neuroscientist. I've always been interested in the effects of alcohol and other drugs on the brain, particularly the brain of adolescence as the brain develops, the influence of alcohol and other drugs on that development. And with this session, we're going to cover some of the fundamental science underlying drug use disorders or addiction. And I'm going to start by talking about the brain mechanisms, and then we're going to explore how people end up addicted beyond the brain, what makes some people more vulnerable than others. Then we'll look at some treatment approaches, some prevention approaches, and throughout the day, I hope that what we cover in this session will serve as the foundation for our future discussions. So what I'm going to talk about is addiction in the brain, and we're going to start by just asking the fundamental question: what is addiction? And addiction, particularly when we refer to drugs, is a disorder in which a person is preoccupied with drug use. They crave drugs, they seek out drugs, they use the drugs compulsively, they have trouble regulating their intake, and then once the drugs wear off, they're in a state of discomfort that then fuels the next round on that cycle. Now, what makes drug addiction problematic as a disease is that the more you use, the longer you use, because of a process called tolerance, you get less of the good, more of the bad, and you end up seeking and using the drug just to avoid the bad. You don't hear about too many heroin addicts saying they want to get high. They usually say they're sick and they want to get well. And so we'll explore what happens in the brain that allows that process to be established. And I think you'll understand by the end of my short presentation why it is so difficult. First of all, why it is that drugs can be so alluring. But secondly, why it's so difficult to break that cycle once it starts. And then we'll hear from the other speakers to talk about some of the predisposing factors and some strategies for preventing the condition. I should mention, drug addiction is a very expensive problem. In the United States alone, it costs us somewhere around $600 billion a year, and we have many, many millions of people that struggle with use disorders. And on the world stage, the World Health Organization estimates that almost 13% of deaths on the planet can be attributed to drug use in one way or another. So it is a very big problem. This is not a minor issue. So what I want to cover, what we're going to cover in this session, are some of the big questions. Why does it happen? How does it happen, which is really what I'll focus on. And then what do you do about it? And we're beginning to learn a lot more about the answers to all of those questions from research funded by the National Institutes of Health and globally. I should mention that the first question about why is a very, very complicated one. The brain aspect, the how, is easy by comparison. The why is very complicated and involves issues about quality of life, mistreatment, genetics, stage of life, for instance. Addiction is much more likely to develop if use begins during the adolescent years because of how the brain is wired, and I will mention a little bit of that. But as we'll be hearing throughout the day, the question of why some people become addicted is complicated, but we are learning more about it, and then that helps inform our treatment and prevention strategies. So what I'll talk about is a little bit of history. We're going to talk about the discovery of something in the brain called your reward system. And as I'll point out to you, the reward system is a small set of structures that, when activated, makes you feel good and makes the brain pay attention to whatever you just did to make you feel good. And then that makes you want to repeat the behavior. So if you go to a restaurant and the food is good, then you want to go back to that restaurant. And if you go to a restaurant and it's bad, you don't want to go back. Well, drugs, in essence, trick the brain into thinking they're very, very good, when in fact they're not. And we'll look at the circuitry involved in that. Then we'll take a look at the fact that we now know, we have known this, but now I think we more fully appreciate the fact that lots of people don't do drugs because they want to feel pleasure an added amount of pleasure. They do drugs because they feel bad and they want to feel less bad. And that actually predicts a faster decline into addiction. So we'll talk about some of those structures involved in that as well. Then we're going to look at how chronic use, so if you keep using the drug, how the brain changes in a way that gets you locked in a cycle where you want the drug, you use the drug, but you don't get as much pleasure as you once got or as much pain relief as you once got. And now when it wears off, you get a lot more pain. And so you want to use the drug just to deal with the pain from the drug, and how you can become locked in that cycle. You can look at pretty much any drug where there's the ability to become addicted, and you'll see this pattern. Cigarettes, nicotine is a pretty obvious one. You crave the drug, you use the drug wears off, you want the drug, you use the drug wears off, and you go round and around in this cycle. And because of the brain and the way it tries to adapt, the brain mechanisms of adaptation actually work against you and get you locked deeper in that cycle. So in the 1950s, my mentor's mentor discovered entirely by accident that in the brain, there are a couple of small areas involved in making you feel rewarded when you engage in a behavior that the brain assumes is important for your survival. So you're thirsty, you drink cold water, you feel some relief and some pleasure. You're hungry, you eat food. Procreation involves some reward so that people will have children and procreate. So there's a natural need for that to shape our behavior over time. And we've learned a tremendous amount about those circuits, and those circuits have really dominated our thinking about how addiction occurs. And we're beginning to get away from that a little bit. It's very central to addiction, but drug addiction is not just about using drugs to feel pleasure. There's much more to it than that. And after chronic use, as I mentioned, you no longer get as much pleasure. So there's much more to it than that, but we will explore in detail how this reward system works so that we can talk about how drugs work. And in essence, what we learned is that there are, and let me just mention the anecdote about this discovery, because I think you'll find it interesting. He put a wire, a little electrode into the brain in the wrong place. He was trying to do an experiment. He got the landmarks on the skull backwards, and he put the electrode in the wrong part of the brain. And what he found was that when the rat recovered and he pressed a little lever to put some electrical current through it, the rat seemed to like it. Whatever the rat was doing, it would do it again. It was trying to figure out, how did I just get that pleasure? And it would repeat it. And to prove that the rat liked it, he gave the rat the lever and let the rat press the lever. And the rat would press the lever until it passed out. It would wake up, press the lever again until it passed out. It didn't want to eat, didn't want to copulate, didn't want to drink water. It just wanted to press that lever. That became the model for drug addiction. And as I mentioned, we're starting to get away from that because it's not quite that simple. But along the way, I'm going to show you a couple of slides, including data, and I will please don't feel the need to try to interpret the brain circuitry or the data. I will tell you the important message. But the important message from this slide is that those brain areas involve a small amount of neurons in an area called the ventral tegmental area that send their axons to a small area called the nucleus accumbens. And whenever you activate those neurons, they release dopamine, a transmitter called dopamine, into the nucleus accumbens. And that dopamine doesn't just serve to initiate changes that make you feel pleasure. That dopamine also initiates changes that make you pay attention and learn about the stimuli associated with the pleasure. So again, you eat a bite of something good, what do? You look down and go, but you look at it because you want to learn, what was that? And you want to repeat that. And the same happens with drugs. So if we look at dopamine levels in that circuitry, what you find is, that, again, data, let me just tell you the take-home message. Things that are natural reinforcers increase dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Food, sex, both of those have been found to increase dopamine. So do drugs. This is cocaine. If you let the rat administer cocaine into its body, dopamine levels go up. Same with amphetamines. Same with heroin. In this case, every time heroin goes down, every time the dopamine levels go down, the rat self-injects again, and then the dopamine levels go up and down and up and down. So it's easy to see that there is an important association between dopamine and drug use. And it turns out that pretty much every drug that's been studied has been found to increase dopamine in the nucleus accumbens in different ways. And in fact, one could argue that the only thing that makes nicotine, alcohol, prescription narcotics, amphetamine similar at all is that they all activate that reward circuitry and basically give you some pleasure and trick the brain into paying attention and learning about the cues because the brain thinks it just struck gold and found something that's very, very reinforcing. Interestingly, food and sex do not produce nearly the amount of dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens that drugs of abuse do. So for instance, here you see that food increases dopamine about 50%. Nicotine increases dopamine about 250%. Amphetamine can increase it up to tenfold. And so the brain, which assumes the bigger the activation in this circuitry, the more valuable the stimuli is for survival, gets tricked into thinking that the drug is very, very good. In addition, as I mentioned, that increase in dopamine triggers attention and learning. Now, during the teenage years, we find that the dopamine system is much more responsive than in children or adults. In other words, the teen brain is built to learn about cues associated with reinforcement so that you can go survive on your own. And the frontal lobes are ready for those inputs to quickly learn about the associations. And so we think that's part of why you're much more likely to develop a drug problem if you start when you're an adolescent versus when you're an adult. One of the consequences of the learning that takes place in the brain, where the brain learns to associate cues with the drug, is that when you present the cues to a person who is addicted to the drug, the brain shows lots of activity, registering and recognizing the drug is valuable and presumably triggering craving and anticipation of that drug. This happens with cocaine. It also happens with alcohol. This is a study looking at alcohol-abusing females. And the more a female drinks per month, the more various areas of the brain become active in response to alcohol cues. And so, we often talk about advertising. There's not a strong literature suggesting that ads make people do things. However, if you're in the market for a car, you'll pay attention to those. If you're addicted to alcohol, those cues are going to mean something to you. And it may trigger craving and make it harder to stay sober. And so this whole phenomenon of increasing reward activity and learning that happens in the frontal lobes is a big part of our current model of how addiction happens. But it's not the only thing. In addition, you have, as drug use continues, the brain essentially tries to adjust in ways that make it harder for it to resist the drug. So these data show various drugs, drug addicts, and basically the brain, wherever you see red on the control side, that's what you want. You want red. That's a high density of activity of the transmitter dopamine. You see on the addicted side, there's less red. The brain deals with this overwhelming amount of dopamine being released by reducing its response to it to try to bring you back to normal. Unfortunately, in doing so, it means the frontal lobes, when you're sober, don't work as well, and it makes it harder for you to resist the strong drive to use the drug. The good news is there is evidence of some recovery here. This is a cocaine addict 10 days after they stop, and then 100 days after they stop. And you can see that the brain is starting to come back. The dopamine receptors are starting to come back. The brain is very adaptive, and it will adjust to the demands placed on it. But you have to get rid of the drug first. As I mentioned, it's not just about pleasure. People don't just do drugs to get high. Lots of people do drugs to get a different kind of pleasure, and that's the pleasure of removing pain. And as I mentioned, people who start to use and find drugs reinforcing because it removes pain are more likely to head down that path toward addiction, and they do so more quickly. I'll give you an example. Let's assume that half of you in the room this evening, with your brains full of information and tired, will have a glass of wine or a cocktail of some sort. My guess is that very few of you will say, I want that cocktail because I want to feel euphoric. You'll say, I need a glass of wine because my brain is stressed out. I need to calm down. I need to relax. You know, there's much more to drug use than activating the dopamine system. And one of the areas of the brain that's central to this is an area called the amygdala, which means almond, because it is a small almond-like structure. And there are different areas to the amygdala, so just allow me to say amygdala as though it's one thing. But the amygdala is involved in learning appropriate responses to stimuli, including negative responses. So if a bear jumps out at you, you will feel fear and run. And you know, you've learned to associate that bear with danger. Or if you, right, so in essence, during the day you go to work and all day long your amygdala is lighting up because you've got deadlines and you're anxious and you're worried. And alcohol and other drugs, particularly benzodiazepines and the opiates, can be very rewarding by calming activity in the amygdala. The problem is, over time, just like with the dopamine system, the brain tries to adapt. So it reduces the impact of the drug on that stress and anxiety circuitry. And so without the drug, you end up feeling more anxious than you did before the drug. And so you end up, you know, it helps keep us locked in this cycle of, we may have started a drug to feel good and to feel less bad, but over time, we feel bad all the time, and we do the drug just to try to feel a little better. And then you're stuck. And the amygdala, by the way, during the adolescent years is hyperactive. And so, you know, teens feel a lot of stress and anxiety. And so that's part of the allure of substances. Teens drink alcohol, they go to a party so they can socialize and feel less anxious. And that's rewarding, so they want to go back. Their frontal lobes are not fully developed yet, so it's harder for them to keep themselves from going back. And so adolescence is one of the risk factors for a fast track to addiction. Oop, this slide didn't come out right, but that's actually okay. I was going to talk about the role of a particular neurohormone called corticotropin releasing factor. And in essence, what I was going to say about this slide is that there's reinforcement in drugs by reducing our feeling of stress and anxiety and emotional pain. So it's more than just about pleasure. And the implications for treatment and prevention, basically, people have to find a way, have to have a way to cope with their stress and anxiety in order to make the drugs less valuable. You take somebody who's an addict, you take the drug away, they need to find a way to feel pleasure and a way to deal with pain without the drug, or it's going to be very difficult for their frontal lobes to withstand the drive to use. Okay, this just is a model of what I was saying. Over time, the more you use the drug, as you slide down the pathway toward dependence or addiction, the amount of pleasure you get or positive reinforcement goes down, and the amount of pain you get when it wears off goes up. And so you end up using the drug to basically deal with the effects of the drug wearing off, rather than to add to your quality of experience. This slide shows something similar. It's a theory by Solomon. It's a fairly well-known theory in psychology. You have two different processes, A process and B process. You feel something good, A process goes up, you feel better than normal. It starts to wear off and it overshoots, and now you're in sort of a decrement of pleasure. And so you want to go back up again and go down and up again and down, but over time, your normal point reduces, and so your normal state is worse, and you do the drug just to try to feel okay. And you get locked in this cycle where you're thinking about the drug and you want the drug, and then you binge on the drug, and then it wears off, and you start thinking about the drug again, and fueled by this negative withdrawal state, you have a hard time keeping yourself from going back. So to summarize, our current understanding of addiction as a brain disease, addiction is a disorder in which the brain learns to place far too much value on a drug and the stimuli associated with the drug, thereby leading to preoccupation and craving. Addiction is a disorder in which the individual, when not using the drug, feels too little reward and too much discomfort, thereby compelling further drug use. There is a theory, my director, George Koob, believes that, in fact, over time with drug use, there's an increase in what he calls the anti-reward system. So it's not just rebound and withdrawal, it's the brain's way of actually, in essence, trying to punish you for doing the drug. To try to keep you from disrupting the balance any further. And addiction is a disorder in which the frontal lobes lose the ability to regulate the urge to use a drug, thereby leading to impulsive drug use. And as I mentioned to you, adolescents are built so that our dopamine system is more responsive so that we can learn. And our ability to control our urges is not fully online, so it's harder for us to control our drives. And our stress system can be very active. So adolescence, as I'm sure we'll discuss over the next couple of days, is by itself a risk factor for developing a drug use disorder. The good news, and I'm not going to go through this slide, but you'll have it when you get the slides, and we're going to be talking about this throughout this session and further sessions. There are things we can do, and the science of prevention and treatment has gotten a lot better. But it requires that we look at drug use and drug use disorders as something more than just an attempt to feel good for fun. For people who develop a problem, it often is that they're initially trying to cope with some underlying discomfort, and then they find themselves caught in this cycle. So I'd like to turn it over to our next presenter. My preference would be to hold off on, if you have any questions, I'd like to hold off until the end of the session to make sure that the other presenters have enough time to speak. And I'm just going to briefly introduce Dr. Gelernter. He is the Foundations Fund Professor of Psychiatry and Professor of Genetics and Neurobiology and the Director of the Division of Human Genetics in the Psychiatry Department at Yale University. And I'm sure he'll tell you anything else you need to know about him. Thank you so much.